Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. In today's episode, we will be talking about how compound loss can affect a person's life. I'm joined by Melo Garcia, who will be sharing her thoughts and experiences on the loss of her mother, daughter and father in a time span of just over 2 years. Following her losses, Melo tried numerous therapists who, in her words, did not speak the language of grief. She went on a journey herself to become a grief specialist by learning about grief, how it had shaped her life and irrevocably changed her. Melo is an avid reader and she shares a number of valuable resources, which you can find all listed in the show notes. I have known Melo for many years, and through our joint journeys with grief we have become not just colleagues, but also friends. For those of you who don't know Melo, here's a short bio. Melo Garcia is a grief specialist and she assists those who have lost what isn't replaceable. She created After Chloe, an online community that provides support, resources and assistance through a difficult grief journey in honor of her daughter Chloe, who passed away in 2011 and after losing both of her parents. Melo felt it necessary to help others deal with the grief and the loss life presents from death, divorce, identity, age, fertility, and empty nesting by creating various types of solutions that the grieving find a life worth living. In 2021, she started the podcast The Resilience of Grieving and hosts an annual online summit during the holidays to provide resources to grievers. Melo allows you to speak your grief in your way, a way that will assist you and inspire you to live in grief. Find out more about Melo on her website and on Instagram under After Chloe. Welcome, Melo. Thank you so much for being here with me today, Melo. It's such a pleasure to speak to you, and I just want to welcome you to my podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Natalie. Congratulations on your podcast, and thank you for having me. Always an honor.
Thank you. How are you doing today?
I am feeling at peace. Definitely feeling at peace today.
So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about your story, your personal story of loss and trauma?
So in 2010, June 27th, at the time, Chloe's dad was working graveyard shifts, and around 2:00 in the afternoon, my mother started calling me frantically, like over and over repetitively. And I usually didn't answer the phone because I wanted Chloe's dad to sleep. He was going to go to work at 6 p.m. that night. So he would wake up maybe 3 hours, 2 hours before work and then go to work. He's a diesel mechanic. And so all of a sudden there's something that like my body just started to feel really warm. And my mom said, I had taken Ambien for the first time last night, and I woke up and Daddy is in the bathroom and he won't come out. Instantly, I knew he was no longer with us. And in a lot of interviews, people will say, well, how did you know that? And I don't know what it is. And I'll get to the other times I've had that feeling, but for some reason, I felt all of the life in me drain out of my body. And I just felt, I went into they say fight or flight, that adrenaline started going, and I was in another state. I was in Nevada and my mother was in California at the time. And so I couldn't call 911. And so I said, Mom, you need to hang up. I want you to call 911. And actually, I had her go to a neighbor's house first. The neighbor wasn't home. And so I said, I need you to call 911. So in the meantime, I called my sister-in-law, and then I called one of my really close friends that was actually dating Chloe's dad's brother at the time, my brother-in-law at the time. And so sure enough, my dad had an aneurysm that had shot to his heart, and he passed away instantly. And so he died in their bathroom. And I remember when my mom called me, she was just like, Daddy's not with us anymore. And I didn't feel this like instant state of grief. I knew that I had to get to her because in my mind, I thought, in such a naive way now that I know what I know. But at the time I thought, well, if I get to her, it'll be okay because at least I still have her. So it took me about 6 hours to get everything together. And I remember I'd have these like bursts of tears and just this realization, like he's dead and he's gone. And so I went to her. And when I got to her, it was around midnight from that 3:00 in the afternoon or 2:00 in the afternoon till midnight. And I got to her around midnight, and she looked as white as a sheet. And we're pretty light skinned as it is, but I mean, she was just like stark white. And so I knew that there was something wrong. So instantly I said, we need to go to the emergency room. We went to the emergency room and she had a massive heart attack. And now that I know it's, broken heart syndrome, definitely. But at the time she had a massive heart attack. And so she was air ambulanced to another hospital. And I remember just thinking, this cannot be happening to me. Like, how does this happen? This only happens in Lifetime movies. This is not happening. This is not my reality, but it was. And so all the while during that time in life, me and Chloe's dad were really trying to have a baby, and we were exploring fertility. And I remember just feeling kind of fatigued and tired, but I just blamed it on, the pre-fertility treatments. And so a few days passed, a couple weeks passed. She finally got out of the hospital. We brought her home, and the new normal kind of set in. And so I went to the doctor because I was just not feeling myself, rightfully so, but I just didn't feel myself. And I found out that I was pregnant.
Oh, wow.
And it was considered to be a geriatric pregnancy because at the time I was, 34, 35 at the time, but it was considered to be a geriatric pregnancy. So I was immediately put on bed rest. My mom was put in cardiac rehab. And that became kind of our new normal for those months. And so in December, my mom was still in cardiac rehab. She was going to come out in January, and Chloe's dad was coming back and forth from Nevada to California. And I so badly just wanted to go back to my life. My life was taken away from me. Everything that I knew was taken away. And I was just kind of like laying in bed every day. And so I begged the doctor to be able to go to Las Vegas, back to Nevada. He said, okay. I went to Nevada. Long story short, my water broke. I had a kidney infection, and it caused my then baby, whose name ended up being Chloe Carolyn Garcia, was born at 24 weeks gestation, which was, prematurely at 24 weeks in layman's terms. And so I had Chloe, and immediately she was taken out of my sight and she was put into the NICU. And that's where she spent her life for 57 days. She ended up dying of NEC. And in very plain terms, it's a disease that attacks the gut, destroys the gut, and destroys her intestines. And so she died on February 22nd, 2011. And when she died, I remember I knew she was going to die. And again, people are like, well, what do you mean you knew? I knew it. I knew that she was not going to live. And one of the surgeons said to me, it's like she's starving to death. And in that moment, and I think one of the only moments, because I don't consider myself to be a very maternal person, but that maternal instinct totally kicked in. And I had a conversation with God, and I said, look, whatever ends up happening, I need my daughter to not feel as if she's starving. I need my daughter to be at peace, whatever that means. That's what has to happen. And in that instant, I felt this wave of peace come over me, and me knowing that my daughter was not going to live on this earth, that in no way prepared me for the moment that she died. And in that moment that she died, I don't talk about this often just because I feel it very personal, but I feel like sometimes it needs to be heard. In that moment, I died as well. Everything that I knew prior to that moment, February 22nd, I no longer knew. I no longer knew anything. And I remember we'd gotten an iPhone 3S. That's how long ago it was. And I think we're like on iPhone 13, 14 now. And I remember scrolling through every contact from the dry cleaners to the butcher to the Safeway grocery store. And I called every contact in that phone because I just wanted someone to help me. I wanted someone to help me to manage the immeasurable, impossible pain that I felt. I felt pain at the top of my head, all the way down to my toes. Like there wasn't a part of me that wasn't in pain, physical pain. And I realized at that moment, wow, this is grief. My mom was still needing around the clock, 24-hour a day care. And I believed so, and again, being naive, I believed that there's no way that my mother can die because I just lost my dad. I lost my daughter. There's just no way this can happen. And my mother lived, and I believe my mother lived for so much longer because I think she was really worried about my mental state and if I was going to be okay or not. She went into the emergency room, as she had many times, on October the 14th. The difference is that night she asked me to ride in the ambulance with her, and she talked to me. She wanted me to reassure her that I was going to be okay. And she said that she was afraid to leave me. I knew in that instance I had a choice. Like I could so selfishly, as I had many times before said, please don't leave me. Don't leave me here alone. Or I could say to her, I'm going to be okay, Mom. I could lie. And I'm going to say, I'm fine, Mom. Everything's okay. And I chose the latter. I chose to lie. And that morning we went to the hospital on October 13th, around 11:30 at night. And she died that following morning at 2:14, 2:15 in the morning. Both Chloe, my dad, and my mom, they all died in the 2:00 hour. So ironically, she died at 2:14, I believe, in the morning. And she took her last breath in front of us and waved goodbye. And I lost my mind. And I did not know how to proceed in life. And the amount of trauma that I've just described happens to people over a lifetime. And it happened to me within a 2-year period, a very short time period, which did not give me a chance to even process, much less work through all of that trauma.
Exactly.
And almost immediately, I had already been through about 14 therapists, and none of them spoke grief. And what I mean by that is none of them knew what I was experiencing. They were telling me stuff about a DSM and trying to diagnose me with, depression or situational depression. And obviously I knew I was depressed, but it ran so much deeper than that. And I needed someone who spoke grief. And so I started to study grieving and loss and really understanding the human mind and understanding how somebody can and cannot digest grief. And that gave me a lot of grace for a really long time. And I knew that I wanted to assist others to allow them to digest and to process their grief as they are able. It just organically happened. The community of After Chloe began in 2015, and we were off to the races. And I say races because it's definitely been a long, long marathon. More blessings than I could ever even fathom, and building a community of grievers and allowing people to process their grief and digest their grief as they see fit, as they are able. that's really kind of my story in a nutshell. The relationship to the trauma, I didn't really understand until 2017, 2018, because for me, what happened is that I had stuffed all that trauma in, and I never really worked through the trauma in relationship to the grief. I just thought it was grief. And so physically, I started getting really bad anxiety. Physically, I would get panic attacks. I've become more introverted than I had been. I'd always been kind of an extrovert introvert. I fully became an introvert. I was no longer able to have functioning relationships. And so I really started to work through the trauma of what had happened and to really understand trauma. And I don't mess around with trauma in the sense that I don't believe that I'm well versed to speak about trauma. So I only like to speak about my own. But in regards to my own, it's something that I'm still working through because trauma brings up other trauma. And there was a lot of trauma in my 37, 38 years of life. And so I really had to unpack that and work through that and continue to work through that. And as I build, the After Chloe community. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
Just 15 minutes ago, you started talking, and within those minutes, you just unraveled so many different losses, one after the other in a very short period of time. And so you mentioned from the time that your mother died until about 2015, when you started After Chloe, you studied grief. Tell us, how did you learn to deal with your loss and trauma? What helped you? What brought you forward to actually then study and learn how to help others?
Well, I had a background in psychology, and so I understood the difference between a DSM, which is like a manual for practitioners, for therapists, for psychiatrists, that is quote unquote a guide. And I understood the difference between what I felt and a traditional diagnosis. And I also understood that I could not be the only one facing the impossibility of not being able to proceed in life and feeling stuck. And I really taught myself to become fluent in grieving. And listen, I have an arsenal of therapists, and I am blessed beyond measure to have the access that I have. And I don't want to take away from therapy one bit in any way, shape, form, or idea. Obviously, now I am a grief specialist. And so obviously, I believe truly, fully, wholeheartedly in cognitive therapy. But at the time, when you don't have the resources, it's like me saying, I really want to make a painting with pink paint. And this is going to be a beautiful painting only if there's pink paint. And I only have access to yellow and blue paint. And so I didn't have the access at the time to a therapist that fluently spoke grief. And so I had to really explore different types of grieving through religious background, through ethnic background, through, where we live. Even the United States grieves differently than Mexico grieves, and the Europeans grieve, and other areas that people live in. Religious beliefs have a huge factor on the way that we grieve. And so for me personally, I had to really give myself permission to say, wow, you just have no idea about grief and loss. And in all truth, I'll be honest with you, like any of my friends, any of my family members that ever went through abandonment, any type of loss, any type of breakup, or any type of grieving, they always came to me and I helped them process it. So I had an understanding about grief, but I never understood pain until I experienced the loss of my child and my parents. I never understood grieving. I didn't understand it. I just, you send flowers, you go to the funeral, you take the casserole, you say you're sorry, you hug them, you hold space with them. But that grief didn't go away. It kept going and going. My mother died in 2012. And so for that 3 years, I immersed myself in truly understanding what grief and loss is in my eyes. And for me to also understand that just because I grieve one way, no one else in the world will grieve that same way. And so that gave me a lot of grace, because I think when we think we're the only ones experiencing this much pain and suffering and impossibility to go on in life, you feel very isolated and alone and lonely. And I've always kind of felt that, even now and after Chloe, I don't have children after Chloe. I don't have parents. I don't have any of that. And so it can be isolating almost. And so I really taught myself to grieve that, to allow that grief to come. And so when you give yourself permission to feel it, to go there, to go that deep, it's something that's really transformative, because you understand, you're like, wow, like I can feel through this. I can get through this. I can feel it. I can get through it. And then I can go back, and then it's going to come again. And so I don't know if you guys have ever been in the sea, right? The ocean. And when you go in the ocean, right, like it's shocking. It's so cold. And then you get in there, it gets kind of warm. And then that wave will come. And that wave comes and it will hit you in the face no matter what. Like, don't get a blowout from, don't get your hair done, because your hair is just going to get drenched. And I really always believe that grief and the ocean are kind of the same things, because the ocean is so beautiful. Grief is so beautiful because it's so reminiscent of love and all the relationship that you had and what you believed that was going to be. And you're grieving all the memories that were, right? And so the ocean, you go in there and you think, oh, this is just going to be warm and soothing, and it's going to hug me, but it's not. You can get bit, you can get pulled under, you can get hit by that wave. And so it's very reminiscent of what, to me, grieving was. And so it took me those 3 years to give myself permission to feel through that grief, to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't a 5-stage. It wasn't just, it would come every few minutes. I would have, grief, spurts of grief. I would have crying spells. I would have anger spells. I would have laughing spells. I mean, I just felt through it. And so for those 3 years, I really gave myself permission just to feel what I felt. And that taught me to grieve.
And that taught you how to swim in the ocean.
Yes.
How to keep yourself
Avid swimmer.
With the waves, under, over, right, left. So that's a beautiful picture that you paint here with the ocean. I love it. And also the question is how does loss and trauma shape us? I mean, you said you don't have to get your hair done. And the picture that came up for me was, you are not going to be the person that you were before. I mean, this is something of a commonality that I hear with my clients as well. Can you tell us how this has shaped you, how learning how to swim in the ocean with grief, with loss, has shaped you and your life?
Prior to my parents and Chloe dying, I had different goals and aspirations. It was a lot about money. It was a lot about finances. It was a lot about, if I'm with blank, blank, I'm going to be happy. Or when I become happy, if I get this, I will be happy. If I do this, if I travel here, I will be happy. I will be content. I will be whole. And what I found in losing my parents and my daughter is that there's this profound void. And nothing, no one, nowhere can fill that. And I had to learn to walk around with that void. And I had to learn, my father always used to say to me, be proud of who you are, always stand up tall. And prior to their losses, I wasn't really proud of who I was. I kept thinking, if I lose 50 pounds, if I get long, beautiful hair, if I had a thinner face, if I didn't have to wear glasses, I kept thinking, if I will, and I would fill in blanks for whatever the moment was. And in grieving and who I had become after the loss, I realized, look, either you're going to have to love yourself because there's no one else to love you. And no one is going to fill that void. No one is going to do this for you. And I recognized that in true honor of my love for Chloe, my daughter who passed away, or in true honor of my parents that both passed away, I had to get really honest with myself and be true to who I am today in this moment and really decide I'm worth it. And I think that that's the biggest shift, because in all of this, after everything I lost, I found myself in all of this. Yeah, I found myself.
That really touched me. And it reminds me of other people that have been guests on my podcast who said similar things in terms of, I am worthy of living a life. I'm worthy of, in their words, healing, or in finding purpose again, in different ways that they worded it. Thank you. What would you want other grievers and healers to know? Or what would you wish you would have known at the beginning of your journey?
You've got to decide that it's yours. It's not mine. It's not Natalie's. It's not whoever you're following on social media. It's not your therapist. It's not your family's. It's yours. When you decide that it's yours, you'll understand that along with that grief comes an amazing life of living after loss, because you have something that no one else can ever have. And that is the love. That is the love. That's the love that remains. And a lot of times people may say to me, what do you mean you saw Chloe less than 57 times? You did not have a life with Chloe. But for me, I don't believe that any woman who experiences pregnancy loss or child loss or baby loss can measure that love, that only they know what it felt like. Because Chloe knew that me and her father were her parents. Chloe was conscious enough to understand that she was ours and we were hers. And no one can take that away. And so when I understood that, and when I really received it as mine, because, going into a space of social media or Facebook, or you go into a space and you feel almost afraid to voice what you believe grief to be, I had to put that down. And that fear turned into acceptance and yelling it from the rooftops that it was mine and only mine. Just like it's yours and only yours.
Now, you are very vocal about your grief and the way people can be grieving, and you are helping a lot of people with different events and annual events that you're doing. And we're going to put all these notes and also the link to your Instagram and your website into the show notes. What would you think that someone who might be listening to this, who is at a loss at what to do, what kind of resources and insight that you have collected in the years? I mean, you even said that you went to 14 therapists in the first few years. I mean, that's a big admiration, because lots of people, they don't even get out of bed and they couldn't imagine trying even just one, or they believe nothing can help me heal this. What insights or what resources would you recommend?
I had no idea about the infant loss community, right? Or I had no idea about the motherless daughters community, or about trauma and grief, the correlation in the first few years. And I think the first book that I read was What Remains by Carol Roswell. And she was talking about the loss of her best friend and her husband. and she happened to be, I think, the in-laws of JFK, and she ended up being a housewife, but this was way before she was ever on the Real Housewives. And then the next book that was recommended to me was a book by Elizabeth Kubler, and Elizabeth Kubler, her foundation now, but at the time, Elizabeth Kubler writes a lot on hospice and on the end of life, right? And so she had written a book with a man by the name of David Kessler. And so David Kessler, during this time, was just, I think, barely writing a book. And I apologize for the dates, but writing a book with a woman by the name of Marianne Williamson. We probably all know her, Return to Love. And so I was like, okay, this one. And so every day I would read kind of this foreign words to me. And I would say, what's wrong? I just don't feel any better. What's going on? And I read that book, I think I've read that book no less, and I'm not exaggerating, probably 70 times. I could probably, quote that book word for word, how well I know it. David would probably laugh if he heard me because of what I'm about, what I'll tell you in a few minutes. And so I, at that time, just was so dependent on that because that was the only correlation I had to close to what I understood my grief to be. And it had a lot of points that resonated with me. I went to USD in San Diego and I was going to a few lectures and I met a therapist that spoke grief fluently. And so I started seeing that therapist once a week as a patient, and that, now a very good friend. And then I would kind of try to venture, and I've never been a big proponent of them, but I kind of venture into the support groups, the online support groups in person. Not really my jam, myself personally, but I went there. And so what I'm getting at is that I was very proactive in finding what spoke to me and what resonated with me. And I think sometimes I irritate those that come to me for support because I just don't take anyone. I will only take you if I feel I can help you. And 99% of the time, I don't think I'm the one to help you. I'm not your cup of tea. I'm not even tea. I'm probably soda. In fact, I think I'm a Red Bull energy drink, right? And so I believe in you being proactive for yourself and saying, I'm going to try this. It may not work, but I'm going to try it out. But I do believe, listen, David Kessler was very effective in helping me through the trauma and the grief of my parents. But David Kessler could not write to me in that book about the loss of my infant. It was a very personal, intimate loss that I had experienced. Now, I read, Grieving Parents by my this wonderful host here. I read, later I read I Had a Miscarriage by Dr. Jessica Zucker. I mean, that book like resonates. It Motherless Daughters by Hope Edelman. I'm a big proponent of reading or listening to an audiobook if you're not in a space of being able to hold attention. Because like I said, it took me a long time to really be able to read that book through. Like I'd read a little blurb and then I couldn't hold attention, right? My ADHD was highly sensitized when I went through the grief and loss. And so I think you have to be proactive in doing only what works for you. If you reach out to me, I ask you probably 10 questions and literally 10 questions, and then I will send you on to who I think can help you best. Even in infant loss, I think there are some people that can help more than other people. And then those other people will help some of my other people. And I'm very honest about that. Yes, have I gone through infant loss? Absolutely, but it's not my jam. It's not my jam. It's not, I never thought, oh, I want to have another baby right after I lost Chloe. So that's, I'm not for you if that's what you want to do. And that's why I ask so many questions. Grief is such a personal thing, and I always compare it, and this is probably not a good analogy for the gentlemen that are listening, but we all wear bras. Most of us wear bras. Some of us go braless, right? But we can still compare that to grief. I went braless for a really long time, didn't work, got a large chest. I needed a bra. So when you go into the bra store, it's not one size fits all. Everybody has their own size. And you've got to get measured and remeasured. And listen, in 3 months, that same bra size may no longer be your bra size anymore. And you may need a new one. And so when I understood that, and really being a resource in all truth, I wish I could highlight every single resource, but I am very honest to say, not everybody is for everyone. Another resource that was huge for me is a woman, she's still here, is a woman by the name of Melody Beattie. Now, Melody Beattie wrote Codependence No More. So everyone will say to me, oh my gosh, that's the codependent lady. That's the Codependent No More lady. No, she's not. She wrote a book called The Grief Club, and she's had a lot of loss. And that is probably the most powerful grief book, one of them, that I have read. That's general, right? But it's very specific to loss of a child, loss of a parent, divorce, breakup. And I recommend that book to certain people. So I don't really care. I know that I said some pretty big names. Natalie's a big name. Dr. Jessica Zucker is a big name. David Kessler's a big name. Melody Beattie in her own right's a big name. But there are also some amazing coaches, but a coach does not replace a therapist. A therapist is your coach through all of this, the first few seasons of the game. And you need a therapist, a licensed grief specialist to guide you through this. A coach is absolutely phenomenal when you're already speaking grief and you have the clarity of what you're feeling and going through. I don't want to knock anyone, and that's not what hopefully you guys are getting from this. But what I want you to get from this is that you must be proactive to understand that my bra size is not your bra size. We can't share a bra. And so unfortunately, you're not going to resonate all the time with everything I believe, and I'm not going to resonate with everything you believe. But I know I'm so happy that grief is being talked about, that there's all these resources, because let me tell you, 10 years ago, kids, there was not that much around.
That's right.
David Kessler was it.
The father of grief, as he called himself. Yes, I heard that today. I thought that was quite funny. Well, Melo, it's always so enlightening to speak to you, and you're going to be remembered as the not every bra fits every person. That's fantastic. So I'm going to look forward actually writing those show notes, because I'm going to ask you to send me all the links that you've mentioned in our show, because these are really good. And as I agree completely with you, which people can find on the literature list on my website as well, there's different books, and you just have to find out the fit for you. Thank you so much for all the beautiful information and your stories and sharing yourself so authentically, moving me to tears. I'm so glad to have this, that you've given this time to this podcast. Thank you so much. Shall we go into rapid fire question?
Absolutely. Hit me.
So, as always, I'm going to ask these 5 questions. They're not really questions, but it's a sentence starter. And I'm going to ask everyone to finish the sentence, just a short answer. Number 1, grieving and trauma means?
Your physical and emotional mind and body feeling through the impossibility of loss.
Number 2, healing means?
That it doesn't look the same for everyone, but that it propels you towards a life after loss.
What I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma.
I am resilient, and I am strong, and I am Chloe's mom and Adolph and Carolyn's daughter.
One thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma.
You will not understand it until you face it.
And last but not least, one specific thing that has changed since my losses and trauma that I wouldn't want to miss?
Seeing life so beautifully and knowing that there is no other love like the love of my parents and my daughter.
What a beautiful way to end this for today. For anyone listening to this and listen to this podcast until this time, make sure you check out Melo's podcast, which I can highly recommend. In the show notes, you'll find all the links to the resources that she's mentioned, including her website and her annual event. Thank you so much, Melo, for your time and for all that you are doing for the grieving community. And it's a blessing to have you not only as a like-minded person speaking grief well, but as a friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie. And may God bless. And you are helping so many. And I just adore you and all that you have taught me and held space for my grief and loss. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep reading. I promise it will get easier.